Over the last month or so, things have gone really downhill for the Russian army. Ukrainian forces have recaptured thousands of square kilometers of territory, mostly in the north around Kharkiv, and as such, Russian morale is apparently at an all-time low. Nonetheless, the war isn't over yet, and the Russian army is still occupying most of Donbass and much of Ukraine's south coast. As you'd expect, attention has since turned to Putin, with endless speculation about how he'll respond to the recent Ukrainian success on the battlefield. After much delay, on Wednesday morning, Putin finally announced his response in a pre-recorded speech broadcast on all major Russian news networks. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the most recent developments from the battlefield, what Putin actually said in the speech, and whether the measures announced will actually help the Russian army. Before we get into the speech, a quick look at the most recent developments on the battlefield. As we detailed in our previous video on the topic, the last few weeks have witnessed Ukrainian forces making rapid progress in Kharkiv, with the new front line stabilizing on the Oskil River in Kharkiv and along the Severtsy Donetsk River in Luhansk. Since then, though, Ukrainian forces have made further progress along the Severtsy Donetsk, taking territory either side of Lyman, which is now essentially surrounded. From here, the Ukrainians have basically two options. Firstly, they could continue eastwards along the river, putting pressure on the Russian campaign in the east. This would essentially involve moving towards Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, two towns captured by the Russians in late June. Or they could move even deeper into northern Luhansk, where there's a lower concentration of Russian troops, with the eventual aim of taking the railway that runs from Valuki to Luhansk city. And this could be tempting, because since the Ukrainians captured Kupiansk a couple of weeks ago, thereby preventing any rail transit between Russian forces in Donbass and the Russian town of Belgorod, this railway has become the primary supply route for Russian forces in Donbass. And if the Ukrainians can reach it, the faltering Russian advance towards the last two Ukrainian holdouts, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, will have their supply lines essentially cut off. At the time of writing, though, it looks like the Ukrainians are going for the first option. As of Monday morning, Ukrainian forces have captured the towns of Yampil and Bilhovika, the latter just 10 kilometers west of Lysychansk. Anyway, that's the most recent update from the battlefield. Things are still going badly for the Russians, which leads us on to the main topic of this video, Putin's speech. Now, the first thing to say about the speech is that it was originally due to happen on Tuesday evening. That's because on Tuesday morning, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics announced that they plan to hold referenda on accession to the Russian Federation, running from September 23rd to September 27th. Russian occupying forces in Kherson and Zaporizhia also announced that they plan to hold referenda sometime soon, although they didn't give a specific timeline. As you'd expect, the international community made it immediately clear that they consider these referenda to be illegitimate, not least because, well, Russia doesn't even control any of these oblasts in their entirety. Regardless, just a few hours later, Russia was continuing with their plans, because the Russian Duma passed new laws introducing the concepts of mobilization, martial law, and wartime into the criminal code, and stipulating new harsher penalties for desertion, surrender, and looting. Then, a few hours after that, Russian state media announced that Putin was due to give a so-called address to the country, something he hasn't done since he announced the special military operation all the way back in late February. At this point then, it was clear that the Kremlin were up to something. They'd announced referenda, changed rules, and planned speeches. However, at 8 p.m, that speech was pushed back to 9, and at 9 it was pushed back to 10, and then finally at 10:30, the editor of Russia Today announced that the speech had been rescheduled to Wednesday morning. It would finally be broadcast at 8 a.m. Moscow time, and opened with Putin's unusual shtick. About 10 minutes in, Putin announced that Russia will be declaring a partial mobilization. This essentially involves deploying reservists and any men that have previously served in the armed forces. All in all, this amounts to about 2.5 million men, 2 million reservists, and another 500,000 former servicemen. Then, a few minutes later, Putin made a thinly veiled nuclear threat, warning NATO that Russia would use all means available to protect its territorial integrity. This is pretty worrying too, because if Russia approves the accession referenda and therefore considers Luhansk and Donetsk to be part of Russia, Ukrainian resistance in these areas would constitute threatening Russia's territorial integrity, therefore legitimizing the use of nuclear weapons under Russia's own nuclear doctrine, at least in Putin's eyes, that is. So, will this big announcement make much of a difference? Well, it does make some sense, given that the Russian army is clearly running out of both weapons and troops. On the weapons front, the Russians have apparently had to buy old Iranian drones and North Korean artillery in order to replenish depleted stockpiles. And on the personnel front, Russia has already tried to raise volunteer battalions to fight in Ukraine. And over the weekend, a video emerged of the leader of the Russian mercenary Wagner group trying to recruit new infantry from a prisoner colony. However, it's both politically risky and perhaps ineffective. It would be politically risky because, well, Moscow has spent the last few months insisting that this is just a special operation, and a partial mobilization tacitly admits that it's really a full-on war. It's also worth mentioning that when he first came to power, one of Putin's big policies was a move away from conscription towards a contracted military service, and any mobilization here essentially amounts to a U-turn on that policy. Furthermore, there's no guarantee that it will even help that much. Mobilizing 2.5 million men will take a minimum of a few months to organize, and it's not even clear that the Russian state has the administrative capacity to perform an effective mobilization. It's also worth noting that so far, volunteer units haven't performed all that well on the battlefield. The Volunteer 3rd Army Corps, for example, which was created in February, apparently only last a few days in Ukraine. And these kind of volunteer groups are notorious for widespread alcoholism and poor discipline. All in all, this announcement is as much political as it is strategic. By declaring a partial mobilization and threatening nuclear weapons, Putin is appeasing Russian nationalists and escalating the war, trying to deter the West from providing further support to Ukraine. Unfortunately for the 2.5 million Russians due for mobilization, this looks unlikely to work, which means that the only real consequence of this decision is that the war will last longer and claim far more lives. But if you want to get further updates on this story, then we provide daily updates in the Daily Briefing. That's our show where every day we provide an unbiased, independent rundown of the day's biggest stories, giving you insights from around the world and helping you understand more than just the headlines. You can watch the show every weekday on the TLDR Daily YouTube channel, or you can listen through your favorite podcast app. Subscribe right now by clicking the link in the description, and never feel left behind by the news cycle again.